Hello and welcome to the History of Bangalore. I am Ramjee Chandran here with episode 110 of season 3, the final season. In the last episode, we were in Malabar, in the smoke and horror of a campaign that burned villages, hanged men from trees, and forced conversions at the point of a sword. I looked at Tipu Sultan, at the contradiction of the heart of the man, the same barbaric sultan who ordered the Malabar atrocities, who also funded the restoration of the Sringeri Mutt and wrote 29 letters of personal devotion to the Shankaracharya. History, as I've said, refuses the tidy and convenient verdict. In this episode, I will talk about the trigger to the Third Anglo-Mysore War, the event that ended the peace with the British. But first, as always, a word of thanks to my sponsors, the Prestige Group, for their corporate support. They make this podcast possible. Building cities one landmark at a time, they transform dreams into reality. You can be a part of the future. Simply add prestige to your life. You might remember from previous episodes Tipu's victory of the Second Anglo-Mysore War following the Battle of Polilur. No matter what anyone says, it was Tipu's victory over the British to complete a war that his father Hyder Ali started but died before he could complete it. That war ended with the signing of the Treaty of Mangalore in 1784, which, like most such other treaties, becomes a piece of paper to be crumbled and tossed aside the moment one of the signatories has a better plan. But it must be said that 5 uneventful years passed after the Mangalore Treaty, even if uneventful means no all-out war. Behind the curtain of such quietude, though, there were years of intense preparation on the side of Tipu Sultan and some on the side of the British. The fact is, no one wanted peace. Both were only buying time. Tipu Sultan used the 5 years to rebuild and reform the kingdom and fortify Bengaluru, garrison town and arsenal, as it had grown steadily in strategic value as the critical hinge between the Carnatic plain and the Mysorean interior. The British, meanwhile, had used this time rather less efficiently, embroiled as they were in all kinds of politics. Warren Hastings, the first Governor-General of India, ever since the British Crown wanted to keep oversight on the East India Company, was recalled to England in 1785. He was under a cloud, later exonerated, but still. That post was then held for a year by the stopgap John Macpherson, until Charles Cornwallis arrived in September 1786, resurrected from his humiliating loss to George Washington at Yorktown in the American War of Independence. Cornwallis, soldier, administrator, man of purpose, looked at the state of the Madras presidency and he was not pleased by what he saw. Indecisiveness, no direction, no goal, an administration drift, while the most dangerous ruler in South India was sharpening his weapons across the frontier. Cornwallis had one goal: to neutralize Tipu Sultan and to secure British dominance over the peninsula once and for all. And he was immediately impatient to begin. But for Cornwallis to actually go to war with Tipu, he needed a cause, a trigger, a transgression by Tipu that would void the Mangalore Treaty and justify the commencement of hostilities by the British against Mysore. And Tipu handed him the trigger. His attack on a small, strategically awkward state on the southwestern coast, Travancore. The history between Mysore and Travancore was already long and sour well before 1789. It actually went back to the years of Hyder Ali's rise, probably around 1784 by elimination, when the ruler of Travancore, by that date it would have been Martandavarma, had sought Mysore's military assistance in consolidating their hold over the Malabar region. But they refused help when it arrived, and worse, they declined to pay the costs incurred without acknowledgement or compensation. Hyder was furious. He did not forget, and neither did his son. When Martandavarma died in 1758, he was succeeded by his nephew Ramavarma, which historical accounts record as equally unscrupulous. Rama Varma's strategy for dealing with Mysore was simple: align with the British, harbour Mysore's rebels, take every opportunity to push Travancore's borders northwards into Mysore territory, or into territory that Mysore claimed of its own or that of its protectorates. Now, chief among those protectorates of Mysore was the tiny kingdom of Cochin, which sat immediately north of Travancore, and Mysore regarded that as a vassal state. Travancore's defensive lines, which was a system of fortifications, trenches, and a vast thorn-filled ditch running along its northern border, repeatedly encroached into Cochin territory. Tipu had objected to that encroachment repeatedly. Rama Varma had ignored the objections with the practiced serenity of a man who knew his British protectors were watching. The fuse was lit in 1789 when Travancore purchased two Dutch-held forts, Travancore and Ayakota, on the Malabar coast. On the surface, this was purely a commercial transaction between sovereign parties, the Dutch and Travancore, but in practice it was a strategic provocation of the first order. Those forts sat within territory that Tipu considered subordinate to Mysore through right of prior conquest. Their transfer to a state which was in close alignment with the British introduced what amounted to a fortified British-protected enclave along Mysore's western flank. Now, if Travancore could operate under British protection from those positions, Mysore's access to the coast, already contested, would narrow further. The frontier would stiffen in ways that constrain future movement, and the slow, creeping encirclement of Mysore, which Tipu had been watching with mounting alarm, would have taken another irreversible step forward. What makes this episode particularly interesting is that Tipu did not immediately reach for his cannons. He protested diplomatically. He raised the matter first with the British administration, and the British, to their credit, as Jan van Lohuisen's study of the Dutch East India Company and Mysore makes clear, actually tried to prevent the purchase, advising Travancore against making such a purchase. But Rama Varma, who didn't want any such advice, went ahead anyway, catching both the British and Tipu equally on the wrong foot. Because of the British position, Tipu had been denied the satisfaction of claiming a clear British conspiracy to point at, and the British had been denied the ability to claim clean hands. And Travancore had demonstrated that it was willing to act on its own initiatives regardless of what Madras, that is the British, wished. Into this already complicated picture came the Raja of Cochin, Tipu's supposed vassal, who had developed, entirely understandably, a powerful fear of what was going on around him. When Tipu summoned the Raja of Cochin to a meeting, the Raja declined on the grounds of illness. Tipu, suspicious that this was some sort of a slimy move, sent a minister to Cochin to assess the real state of the Raja's health. When the minister arrived, the Raja ran and locked himself inside a room and sent word that he was too unwell to receive visitors. It fooled no one. This entire sequence, as historical records state, read less like diplomacy and more like a very anxious farce. A small ruler hiding behind closed doors, while the most formidable military power in South India waited politely outside. By late 1789, Tipu had run out of patience. The diplomatic options had been exhausted, the coast was narrowing, and Cornwallis had arrived in India and was steadying the British hand. The Nizam was watching, the Marathas were watching. The window in which Mysore could force the issue without facing a fully assembled coalition was closing. Tipu faced a choice between accepting a creeping contraction of his influence, ceding the western flank to Travancore and through Travancore to the British, or forcing the issue while the British coalition building still depended on persuasion rather than momentum. How far did Tipu go? Find out after this quick commercial break when I will plunge into that fateful story. Right after this.
Maximum connectivity, maximum luxury, maximum lifestyle. Live your max at Prestige Raintree Park. Opulent residences nestled in 21 acres of breathtaking landscape with 1 lakh plus square feet of clubhouse, 3 swimming pools, and ample leisure and sports amenities. Experience exquisite living at Prestige Raintree Park in prime Whitefield with schools, offices, hospitals, and shopping malls just a hop away. Call 81399 81399 or visit prestigeconstructions.com to know more. Radar approved.
On the 24th of December 1789, Tipu Sultan with his army, positioned 6 kilometers from the Travancore lines, made one final gesture towards diplomacy. He sent an envoy, conveyed with some theatre, on an elephant with a howdah, offering to open negotiations. That gesture was ignored. 5 days later, on the 29th of December 1789, Tipu Sultan attacked Travancore. Even after this first attack, the situation retained a strangely diplomatic ambiguity. Tipu had not formally declared war on Travancore. Doing so would have meant declaring war on the British, whose ally Travancore was. He appears to have made the calculation that a rapid, decisive military strike could resolve the territorial disputes on the ground, present Travancore and the British with a fait accompli, and force a negotiated settlement on Mysore's terms. He was, in this calculation, wrong. The diplomacy that followed the December attack was desultory, to say the least, and achieved nothing. By April 1790, Tipu had decided that half measures had served their purpose, and then he launched a full invasion. He opened with a fusillade of cannon fire, followed by infantry. Ayakota and Kranganore, the 2 Dutch forts that had started this entire dispute, fell to him quickly. Tipu took them despite the presence of British forces in the vicinity, who declined to act because they were waiting for orders from the Madras Presidency and they had received none. So they couldn't do anything but sit back and watch Tipu take the forts. Other forts along the Travancore lines too were taken, and the defensive works, those great thorn-filled ditches and the fortifications, were all destroyed. 200 captured cannon and vast quantities of ammunition were packed up and sent to Bangalore. Tipu was in the full momentum of a rout, and then the news arrived. The British had been assembling forces at Tiruchirappalli. Cornwallis had decided, in what was, from the British perspective, entirely rational, that Tipu's attack on a British ally constituted a violation of the Treaty of Mangalore and therefore a casus belli, which is a justification for war. This was communicated formally in a letter from General William Meadows to Tipu, informing him that his attack on Travancore was an act of war against the British. Now, whether this was genuinely Cornwallis's conclusion or the pretext that he had been looking for is a question that historians are still resolving and arguing about. The British had their own reasons to want war. As I mentioned in the beginning of this episode, Cornwallis had arrived in India to find the Madras Presidency in a state that appalled him, hesitant, financially overstretched, and facing a Mysore that had spent the peace years becoming stronger while the British had spent them becoming more and more indebted. Incidentally, there's a fascinating footnote to Cornwallis's arrival in India. There exists a letter, purportedly written by King George III himself, which the French intercepted, and which suggested that Cornwallis had been sent to India not merely to fight Tipu Sultan, but to wrest control of the entire country from the East India Company and hand it directly to the crown. Now that is a fascinating story and it merits its own episode, so I will get to that letter and what it meant in a later episode. Back to the story. Cornwallis had also been watching the diplomatic weather with the trained eye of a professional soldier who understood that coalitions decay when left unused. The Nizam of Hyderabad was available, the Marathas were available, the moment was available. So whether or not Tipu had actually triggered the war in any meaningful sense, it was a war that Cornwallis was ready to fight, and as before, this was the moment of convenience. It's worth pausing here on what Travancore's purchase of those 2 Dutch forts actually meant in the larger strategic picture, because it is easy from the distance of 2 centuries to see this as a minor territorial squabble that a more restrained Tipu may have simply absorbed. This misreads the geography. Malabar was not merely a revenue source for Mysore. It was Mysore's lifeline to the world beyond the plateau. Without the coast, Mysore could not receive French arms, French officers, or French military assistance of any kind. The British, as I have said repeatedly on this podcast, understood this with perfect clarity, which is why one of the primary objectives of the Third Anglo-Mysore War, as we will see in subsequent episodes, was to convert Mysore into a landlocked state, therefore sealing it off from the sea and worse, from Europe permanently. When Tipu attacked Travancore, he was defending the only geographic feature that made Mysore's long-term survival conceivable. He was also, in doing so, handing Cornwallis the coalition that he needed. The Triple Alliance now that Cornwallis assembled in the months following the Travancore attack was the most formidable military combination yet brought to bear against Mysore. The Maratha Peshwa joined, motivated by the opportunity to recover the Doab territories that Tipu had seized and held. The Nizam of Hyderabad joined, driven by his habitual anxiety about Mysore and his equally habitual Mr. Flip-Flop instinct to be on the winning side. Together with the company's own forces, this coalition would field an army on multiple fronts simultaneously. It would stretch Mysore's military resources across a theatre of war far wider than any single campaign it had yet faced. Had the Marathas remained neutral, the strategic picture may have been very different. Without Maratha cavalry to secure supply lines and provide intelligence across the northern approaches, Cornwallis would have faced the Mysore plateau with a force burdened by heavy artillery and insufficient mobile support, vulnerable to the kind of sustained harassment and attrition at which Tipu excelled. A neutral Pune would have left Tipu free to concentrate his forces against a single enemy, with a real possibility of forcing a British retreat. This is one of the great might-have-beens of 18th century Indian history. But all that said, Pune did not remain neutral, and the man who made sure about that was an East India Company resident at Pune named Charles War Mallet, a diplomat whose contribution to the Third Anglo-Mysore War has been obscured by the more dramatic figures who fought it in the field. Mallet worked the Maratha court with a combination of flattery, money, and the systematic exploitation of Maratha territorial grievances against Mysore. Mallet was frustrated at one point to find himself crossing paths in the streets of Pune with Tipu's own envoys who had been granted access to Nana Fadnavis and who were conducting their own nocturnal diplomacy in parallel. The Maratha court was playing both sides for as long as it could. The diplomatic tipping point came on the 8th of June 1790 when the Peshwa granted Tipu's ambassadors a formal audience despite Mallet's strenuous protests. It was a calculated snub, a signal that the Marathas had not yet made their decision and they were not to be taken for granted by the British. But Mallet persisted. He had on his side a persuasive combination of British credit, Maratha self-interest, and the evidence of Tipu's attack on Travancore as proof of an ambition that would not stop at Mysore's current borders, which means it could go well into Marathas. By the time Cornwallis was ready to march, Mallet had his treaty, 10,000 Maratha cavalry committed to act alongside the British forces. Tipu Sultan had attacked the small state over 2 forts and a thorn-filled ditch. What he had produced with that single decision was the most dangerous coalition Mysore had ever faced, assembling it on 3 sides simultaneously, and it would be a war that he would not win. From this point of the podcast, we squarely enter the British era. In the next episode, we look at the man who led the coalition, Charles Cornwallis, recalled from retirement, given a second chance in life, and determined not to repeat the humiliation of Yorktown. Episode 111 will be the resurrection of Cornwallis, and that is coming up pretty soon. I am Ramjee Chandran, and this is the history of Bangalore.